At 12,000 feet, a fighter pilot doesn't need courage. He needs time. Because when a Japanese Zero appears behind your wingman, firing from point-blank range, time is the only thing that decides who lives and who doesn't. On Christmas Day, 1944, over Negros Island, one American pilot saw that clock running out. His formation was flying heavy, external fuel tanks still attached. Every flight manual was clear. Do not dogfight like this. At low altitude, with that much weight, survival drops to near zero. The safe move was simple. Jettison the tanks, climb away, reset the fight. But below him, his wingman was already dying. There are moments in combat where skill no longer matters. Only choice does. In the next few seconds, one pilot would dive, physics would take control, and only one aircraft would come home. This is not a story about tactics. It's a story about what happens when saving yourself means letting someone else die. If you're interested in World War II stories that go beyond victories and numbers, stories about real decisions made under impossible pressure, make sure to subscribe. New documentaries every week, focused on the moments history usually skips. The Pacific Air War did not forgive hesitation. By late 1944, American fighters no longer struggled for air superiority. They hunted for it. Fighter sweeps ranged far beyond friendly lines, searching for Japanese aircraft before they could reach transports, bombers, or troops on the ground. The objective was simple: deny the enemy the sky. On the morning of December 25, 1944, 4 P-38 Lightnings lifted off from their base in the Philippines and turned south toward Negros Island. It was supposed to be routine. No escort mission, no bombers to protect. Just a sweep. Find enemy fighters, destroy them, clear the airspace. But routine missions were often the most dangerous. They carried fewer safeguards and more assumptions. Each P-38 was heavy. 2 large external fuel tanks hung beneath the wings, extending range but crippling maneuverability. With tanks attached, the aircraft was stable in level flight but unforgiving in a turn. The manuals were explicit. Every pilot knew the rule: jettison before combat. Rules, however, only mattered if there was time to follow them. Below the formation, sunlight reflected off the ocean, and the green spine of Negros Island cut across the horizon. The radio was calm. No warnings, no calls for help. For several minutes, the sky appeared empty. Then the enemy appeared where Doctrine said they shouldn't. 7 Japanese fighters rose from below, not fleeing, not scattering, but climbing to meet the Americans head-on. They were escorting a transport aircraft moving low and fast toward cover. The moment the two formations spotted each other, the geometry of the fight collapsed. Altitude advantage was gone. Surprise was gone. Time was gone. The American flight leader had seconds to choose between textbook procedure and immediate action. Climbing would cost distance. Distance would save the transport. Waiting meant losing the target entirely. The order came quickly. Engage now. The P-38s rolled into a dive, heavy and fast, fuel tanks still attached. Below them, the Japanese fighters did not break. They tightened their formation and climbed aggressively. This was not a defensive reaction. It was an invitation. That was the first sign something was wrong. Inexperienced pilots avoided head-on engagements. Veterans welcomed them. As the formations closed, the Japanese fighters split. Some climbed high, forcing the Americans to track multiple threats at once. Others stayed low, positioning themselves behind the trailing P-38s. The fight fractured instantly into isolated problems. One of those problems became fatal. A Japanese Zero slipped unnoticed behind one American aircraft and stayed there. Tight turn, clean airframe, no external tanks. The Zero closed the distance effortlessly. The warning came over the radio too late. "Zero on my 6. The call wasn't panicked. It was flat, controlled. The voice of a pilot who understood exactly what was happening and how little time remained. Tracer rounds stitched the air behind his aircraft. Smoke streamed from one engine. The P-38 shuddered under the strain. At low altitude, damage compounds fast. There is no room to dive away, no space to recover energy, no margin to bleed speed. Every second inside a turning fight brings the ground closer. The rest of the formation saw it at once. This was no longer a fighter sweep. It was a countdown. Standard procedure offered clear answers. Drop the tanks, break away, climb, regroup, return with altitude and speed. Those rules had saved countless lives, but they all assumed something critical. They assumed the pilot under attack could survive long enough for help to arrive. Here, that assumption was false. The Zero was already inside the turn. Its nose tracked smoothly, patiently. The wounded P-38 could not outrun it, could not dive, could not roll away. At this altitude, there was no escape path left. Someone had to intervene immediately, or the wingman would die. And whoever intervened would do so under the worst possible conditions. Heavy aircraft, low altitude, experienced enemy, no margin for recovery. This was the trap, not set by the Japanese pilot alone, but by geometry, timing, and the unforgiving mathematics of air combat. The situation allowed no clean solution. Every option carried a cost. Every delay made the outcome worse. Above the fight, the rest of the sky remained deceptively calm. The ocean glimmered. The island waited. Below, seconds were burning away, and in that narrowing space between doctrine and reality, one pilot prepared to make a choice that could not be taken back. Every fighter pilot in the Pacific learned the same lesson early. Survival was not about bravery. It was about energy. Altitude was life. Speed was insurance. Anything that robbed a fighter of either one turned combat into a gamble, and gambles killed pilots quickly. That truth shaped doctrine, training manuals, and every briefing room lecture from California to New Guinea. Nowhere was that rule clearer than with external fuel tanks. On the P-38 Lightning, external tanks extended range dramatically. They made long patrols and deep strikes possible across the Pacific's vast distances. But they came at a cost. Once attached, the aircraft's aerodynamics changed completely. Roll rate slowed, turn radius widened, drag increased sharply. Energy bled away faster than the engines could replace it. Every pilot knew the numbers. Every instructor repeated them. With tanks attached, the P-38 was not a dogfighter. It was a delivery system, meant to travel, not to turn. Doctrine was blunt. Jettison before engagement. At altitude, that rule worked. A pilot who saw the enemy early could drop the tanks, dive with speed, fire, and climb back out before the enemy could react. That was how American fighters survived against lighter, more agile aircraft, like the Japanese Zero. But doctrine assumes a controlled entry into combat. What it does not account for is surprise at the wrong moment. At low altitude, with limited warning, the mathematics shift violently. There is no time to climb, no space to extend away, no buffer to recover speed once it is lost. A fighter caught heavy in a turning fight near the ground is no longer managing energy. It is spending it faster than physics allows. That was the environment forming over Negros Island. The Japanese pilots understood this perfectly. Their aircraft were lighter. Their turn radius was tighter. They were comfortable fighting close to the ground, where American advantages in speed and dive performance diminished. Against a heavy P-38, the Zero did not need to win quickly. It only needed to stay close. Every second forced the American pilot to pull harder. Every pull reduced airspeed. Every reduction in airspeed brought the stall closer. At altitude, a stall could be recovered. Near the ground, it became a sentence. The manual spelled it out clearly. A snap stall at low altitude, especially with asymmetric drag from external tanks, was almost always unrecoverable. Recovery required height, thousands of feet, not hundreds. Below that threshold, the aircraft would depart controlled flight faster than any pilot could correct. This was not theory. It was statistical reality. The odds were so well known that pilots rarely tested them twice, which is why Doctrine insisted on one thing above all else. Never allow yourself to be pulled into a low-altitude turning fight while heavy. Yet Doctrine also assumed another condition. It assumed the pilot had the freedom to disengage. In this fight, that freedom did not exist. The wingman under attack could not break away. His aircraft was damaged. His altitude was limited. The Zero behind him did not need to maneuver aggressively. It simply followed, waited, and fired in short, precise bursts. From the outside, the solution looked obvious. Drop the tanks, climb, regain control of the engagement. But solutions that look obvious on paper often collapse in real time. Dropping external tanks was not instantaneous. The release mechanism took seconds, seconds during which the aircraft remained vulnerable, still heavy, still slow to respond. In those seconds, the Zero would not disengage. It would press the attack. Doctrine did not address what to do when the enemy could kill someone faster than procedure could save them. That gap between instruction and circumstance is where pilots died. The American flight had entered a geometry that favored the enemy completely. They were heavy. They were low. The Japanese pilots were experienced enough to recognize it and disciplined enough to exploit it. The fight was no longer about winning. It was about preventing loss. And preventing loss required intervention at exactly the wrong time. This was the central contradiction of the moment. Every correct tactical choice led away from the pilot who was about to die. Every morally acceptable choice led directly into the conditions that Doctrine warned against. The manuals could not resolve that contradiction. Neither could training. Doctrine can tell a pilot how to fight. It cannot tell him who to abandon. As the Zero tightened its turn behind the damaged P-38, the window narrowed further. Speed fell. Altitude vanished. The ground rose steadily into relevance. There were still, technically, options left. Drop tanks, pull away, let the wingman fend for himself. Those options aligned perfectly with Doctrine, probability, and personal survival. They also aligned with a single outcome. The wingman would not live long enough to benefit from them. This is where Doctrine ends and reality begins. Air combat does not always offer a choice between right and wrong. Sometimes it offers a choice between certain loss and possible loss, between watching something happen and becoming part of it. The Japanese pilots had engineered that moment carefully, not with brilliance, but with patience and positioning. They had forced the Americans into a decision space with no clean exits. Above the fight, the sky remained clear. Below it, the clock was nearly empty. And someone was about to move, not because the manuals allowed it, but because waiting no longer did. There is a moment in every air fight when time compresses, not metaphorically, physically. Speed, distance, and altitude collapse into a narrow corridor where events no longer unfold in sequence, but overlap. Decisions stop being planned. They become reactions measured in fractions of seconds. This was one of those moments. The Japanese Zero stayed glued to the damaged P-38, perfectly positioned, never rushing the kill. Its pilot understood the situation. He did not need a dramatic maneuver. He only needed patience. At this altitude, patience was lethal. The American wingman fought the controls, pulling harder, bleeding speed with every turn. Smoke streamed from one engine. The aircraft shuddered, warning of limits already crossed. He could not dive. He could not climb. He could only turn, and the Zero turned tighter every time. Above them, another P-38 rolled into position. Heavy, slow to respond, external tanks still attached. This was the last intervention window. Doctrine offered a final chance to survive. Drop the tanks, break away, live. But the geometry of the fight made that option meaningless. If the tanks were jettisoned, the aircraft would lose them cleanly, but not instantly. In the seconds required for separation, the Zero would remain free to fire. It would not chase the heavier aircraft. It would finish the damaged one. The calculation was simple. Disengaging saved one pilot. Engaging might save two, or none. The difference between might and certain was everything. The American pilot rolled inverted and pulled down hard, committing to the dive. Speed surged past 400 miles per hour. The ground rushed upward. The Zero pilot saw the move immediately and reacted, breaking off the wounded aircraft to face the new threat. That reaction was the goal. For the first time in the fight, the wingman was no longer the primary target. But now the trap closed completely. The Zero turned into the dive, light and responsive. The P-38 followed, but it followed with weight and drag, fighting every movement. The external tanks bit into the airflow, pulling energy out of the aircraft faster than the engines could replace it. The turn tightened. Airspeed fell. 220 miles per hour. 210. 200. The P-38 was approaching its stall margin at an aggressive bank angle, with asymmetric drag hanging under both wings. Every additional pound of pressure on the stick brought the aircraft closer to departure from controlled flight. The Zero pilot felt none of that strain. His aircraft was built for this environment. Low altitude, tight turns, immediate response. He began to pull inside the American's turn radius. This was the decisive instant. If the American pilot jettisoned the tanks now, recovery was still theoretically possible. The aircraft could regain energy, widen the turn, and escape. The manuals would approve. The statistics would favor survival. But the Zero was already adjusting its nose. It was turning back toward the wounded P-38. The tanks were still attached. The American pilot's left hand moved toward the jettison handle and stopped. 2 seconds. That was all it would take. 2 seconds for the tanks to release. 2 seconds for the Zero to ignore the threat and fire again. 2 seconds for the wingman to die. Waiting was not neutral. Waiting was a decision. The American pilot pulled harder. The control stick pressed against his body. The P-38 protested violently. The stall warning sounded, a continuous scream that drowned out everything else. The aircraft was no longer flying efficiently. It was being forced around the turn through brute control input. Airspeed dropped below the margin. Physics took over. The left wing stalled first. Lift collapsed asymmetrically. snapping the aircraft sideways with no warning. The P-38 rolled violently, entering a snap roll that immediately degraded into a spin. The transition was instant and unrecoverable at this altitude. At 1,200 feet, recovery from a snap roll required space that no longer existed. Training kicked in automatically. The pilot released back pressure, neutralized the ailerons, applied opposite rudder, reduced power on the stalled side, increased power on the other. The aircraft responded, but not enough. The external tanks created uneven drag, resisting the corrective inputs. The spin flattened. The nose dropped toward the ground. Airspeed increased rapidly as altitude vanished. 900 feet. 600. The pilot jettisoned the tanks. They separated cleanly and tumbled away, but the spin did not stop. The energy state was too degraded. The correction had come seconds too late. 400 feet. The ground filled the windscreen. There was no panic. The pilot keyed the radio once. "I'm not going to make it. Get out of here." The transmission was calm, procedural, final. 3 seconds later, the P-38 struck the jungle at terminal velocity. The impact was catastrophic. The aircraft disintegrated on contact. Fuel ignited instantly, sending a column of fire and smoke rising through the trees. The Japanese Zero pulled away. The wingman leveled his damaged aircraft and looked back. The fireball was visible for miles. The intervention had worked. The Zero never returned to finish the kill. The wingman was alive. The sky above the crash site cleared as quickly as it had filled. The remaining aircraft reformed, re-engaged, and drove the enemy away. The fight continued, but one pilot was already gone. There would be time later to analyze what happened, to debate tactics, to question judgment. In this moment, none of that mattered. The decision had been made when waiting became unacceptable, when survival for one required abandonment of another, when the difference between doctrine and reality collapsed into a single action. The American pilot did not win the fight. He changed its outcome. The moment after impact was strangely quiet. There was no explosion heard in the air, no shockwave felt in the cockpits above. Only a column of smoke rising through the jungle canopy, marking the exact point where one aircraft had ceased to exist. The wingman, who had been moments from death, leveled his damaged P-38 and stared back at it. His engine coughed. Smoke still trailed behind him, but he was alive. The Zero that had been on his tail was gone. He did not say anything on the radio. None of them did. The remaining American fighters regrouped automatically, training taking over where emotion could not. They scanned the sky, checked fuel, counted aircraft. 3 answers came back instead of 4. There was no parachute. At that speed, at that altitude, there could not be one. The fight itself ended quickly. The Japanese fighters disengaged once their advantage disappeared. Without the distraction of the damaged P-38, the Americans regained control of the engagement. The remaining enemy aircraft were driven off, leaving the sky over Negros Island empty again. But the mission was already lost. On the flight back to base, no one spoke unless necessary. The radios carried only short procedural calls, headings, fuel states, landing order. Everything else remained unsaid. When the P-38s touched down and rolled to a stop, the pilots stayed in their cockpits. Engines idled. Canopies remained closed. Ground crews approached, then hesitated, sensing something was wrong. Minutes passed. Finally, one pilot shut down and climbed out. He walked slowly toward an empty revetment, one that would never be used again. He stopped there and stared, unable to move. Survival has a cost. Sometimes it is paid by the one who lives. Later that day, the squadron commander gathered the reports. He read the mission timeline, the radio transcripts, the eyewitness accounts. He reconstructed the geometry of the fight and the sequence of decisions that led to it. On paper, the violation was clear. External tanks had remained attached. Engagement had occurred at low altitude. Doctrine had been ignored. By every technical standard, the maneuver was unjustifiable. And yet the outcome was undeniable. A wingman who should have died did not. In his report, the commander wrote carefully, choosing each word with precision. The pilot had knowingly entered a fatal engagement. He had done so to protect another aircraft under immediate threat. He had accepted the risk, fully aware of the likely result. This was not confusion, it was intent. 3 days later, a recovery team reached the crash site. It lay deep in Japanese-held territory. Guerrilla fighters secured the area while the remains were retrieved under fire. There was little to recover. The impact had left no doubt about the outcome. The squadron held a memorial service. One pilot did not attend. The wingman who had survived was grounded. He was deemed unfit to fly, not because of injury, but because his hands would not stop shaking. He replayed the radio call again and again in his head. "I'm not going to make it. Get out of here." Those words were not heroic. They were instructional. They meant the decision was complete. News of the loss traveled quickly. In the United States, headlines framed the story in familiar terms. A top ace killed in action. A promising career cut short. A tragic end just shy of a record. That framing was easy. It was also incomplete. Inside the squadron, no one spoke about records. They spoke about absence, about the empty space in the formation, about the knowledge that one man had done exactly what he always did, and this time, it had cost him everything. The paperwork moved up the chain of command. Recommendations were written, statements reviewed. The language became more formal, more distant. Conspicuous gallantry, above and beyond the call of duty. Voluntary action in the face of overwhelming odds. On January 8, 1945, approval was granted. The citation described the act in precise military language, but one sentence mattered more than all the rest. He gave his life to protect his wingman. That was the consequence. Not just death, but exchange. One life traded so another could continue. The surviving wingman would live for decades. He would marry, have children, become a teacher. Every year, on December 25th, he would tell his students about the man who died so he could live. The pilot who made that choice would never see any of it. He would remain frozen at the moment of impact. Forever 24 years old, his future collapsed into a single decision made in seconds. There are many ways to measure success in war. Victories, kills, territory gained. None of those capture what happened over Negros Island. The outcome was not a win. It was a debt paid in full. And in the silence that followed the fight, that debt was understood by everyone who flew back without him. History is rarely fair. It remembers numbers more easily than motives, victories more readily than choices. In the record books of the Pacific War, fighter aces are ranked by kills, not by who they saved. In that accounting, One name stands above the rest. 40 victories. The top ace. The story that fits neatly into a headline. The pilot who died over Negros Island stopped at 38. Second place. Second does not sell. Second does not become legend. But inside the squadron, numbers were never the measure. Those who flew with him understood something the records never captured. They understood that his reputation was not built on aggression, but on reliability. If he was in your formation, you came home. Not because he promised it, but because he had already proven it again and again. That reputation was not an accident. Throughout his career, the same pattern repeated. When Doctrine said disengage, he stayed long enough to make sure others survived. When the safe option appeared, he chose the one that protected someone else first. He did not chase danger. He accepted it when avoidance meant loss. On December 25, 1944, that pattern reached its limit. There are two ways to interpret what happened that day. The first is tactical. A pilot violated Doctrine. He fought at low altitude with external tanks attached. He allowed his aircraft to bleed energy until recovery became impossible. The result was predictable. The aircraft stalled. The ground came too quickly. From that perspective, the outcome was inevitable. This interpretation is correct. It is also insufficient. The second interpretation begins earlier, before the dive, before the stall, before the impact. It begins at the moment when the wingman's voice came over the radio, and the time remaining dropped below the threshold of procedure. At that moment, there was no decision that preserved everything. One option protected the pilot who disengaged. The other protected the pilot who could not. Both carried consequences. Only one delayed death. What happened next was not a failure of judgment. It was the acceptance of a trade. The pilot understood the math. He understood the physics. He understood that engaging heavy at low altitude against an experienced enemy was almost certainly fatal. He also understood something else. If he waited, someone else would die with equal certainty. So he moved. That is the difference between recklessness and responsibility. Recklessness ignores consequences. Responsibility chooses between them. The pilot did not die because he believed he was invincible. He died because, for the first time, survival required abandonment, and that was a cost he would not pay. That distinction matters, because war is full of moments where outcomes are framed as mistakes when they are, in fact, decisions made under impossible constraints. The clarity comes later, when the noise fades and the alternatives can be examined without pressure. From that distance, the truth becomes simpler. The wingman lived. Everything else followed from that. The surviving pilot carried that knowledge for the rest of his life, not as guilt, but as obligation. He spoke about it not to glorify sacrifice, but to explain its weight. He understood that his future existed because someone else had chosen to give up theirs. That understanding shaped him. It also shaped the memory of the man who died. Within the unit, his legacy was not that he was second best. It was that he never let anyone die alone. That he treated formation flying as a bond, not a convenience. That when the moment arrived where loyalty demanded payment, he did not hesitate. He had made that choice before and survived. This time, he did not. And that is what history often misses. The difference between a hero who survives and one who does not is not always skill or luck. Sometimes it is simply the moment when all safe options disappear and only values remain. On Christmas Day 1944, over Negros Island, that moment arrived. One pilot dove, one pilot lived, one pilot did not. The math was clear. The choice was clearer. And long after the records were written, the men who flew that day remembered him, not for how many aircraft he destroyed, but for how many people he refused to abandon. That is not tragedy. That is purpose. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing to the channel. We focus on the human decisions behind history, the moments where outcomes weren't guaranteed and choices mattered more than victories. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering.